So, the Xbox Project Scorpio specs were revealed today by Digital Foundry, which is a vertical subset of Eurogamer, and we basically got some confirmation that what Microsoft was saying was right, and we got kind of an example of what the system could do. Now, I'm going to talk about the Xbox Scorpio, its situation with the games and stuff some other time. I just want to focus on hardware strength this time and roughly where the system's going to land in terms of comparisons to PCs, comparisons to other consoles, and we're going to take an estimate to see, does it perform exactly as they said in the Eurogamer article? So in the Eurogamer article, we actually heard them say that it actually reaches roughly GTX 1070 power levels. If we look at the hardware specs, we can actually find a PC equivalent. So the Xbox Scorpio uses a customized APU, just like all the other consoles on the market, and its rough specs, at least the stuff that was revealed to us that's going to matter in our comparison here, is we have a memory bandwidth of 326 gigabytes per second, roughly 40 compute units, which gives us 6.0 teraflops of compute performance. Now, if we take a PC graphics card that's kind of similar that was recently sold, was the AMD R9 390X. Now, that thing's running on a 28 nanometer manufacturing process, so it's nowhere near as efficient, and it sucks way more power than the Xbox Scorpio would, but all that matters now is how it performs. So that one's memory bandwidth is 384 gigabytes per second, has 44 compute units, and gives us roughly 5.9 to 6 teraflops depending on the clock speeds and how you have that all set up. The memory clocks and stuff like that are all interesting, but that's not going to matter in our comparison here, and you can easily just watch the Digital Foundry video to find out exactly all the other information like the memory clocks and the cooling. So we can see the 390X is similar. It has some more compute units and more memory bandwidth, but different manufacturing and stuff brings it to a power level that's just slightly below the Scorpio, at least if we're looking at compute performance. Now, the 390X was built to compete with the NVIDIA GTX 980, and the GTX 1060 gives us roughly GTX 980 levels of power. So we can take the Xbox Scorpio and compare it to the GTX 1060 to get a rough estimate. Now, my original intention here is to borrow my brother's GTX 1060 and do kind of a benchmark test and match what they were doing when they were testing the Xbox Scorpio for this reveal, but I didn't really get a chance to do that, so I'm going to use my GTX 1070, and that actually matches up. That's actually okay, because we were told in the article that we should be expecting roughly GTX 1070 level performance. My personal estimate, but I have not recorded the benchmarks yet, I'm recording this audio clip before I do the benchmarks, but my personal estimate is that it's going to be roughly in between the GTX 1060 and 1070 in performance. So let's take a look and set up this benchmark here. So the benchmark shown to Digital Foundry was a demo of Forza Motorsport 6, which is an Xbox One game, running at 4K 60 FPS on the Scorpio. Now what they did was they took the Xbox One version and basically retained the same graphical settings and performance, so the Xbox One version ran at 60 frames per second, the Scorpio version also ran at 60 frames per second, but they upped the textures to be more compliant with 4K displays, and they upped the resolution obviously to 4K, but other than that, it's pretty much sticking with Xbox One levels of power. And what they got was a pretty effortless 60 frames per second, and the GPU was only being used at about 60 to 70% power level. So what we're going to do on my GTX 1070 PC here, it's also using an i5 4690K processor, but that's less relevant to this, is we're going to take Forza Motorsport 6 Apex, which is the free-to-play PC port of Forza Motorsport 6, which is using, the same engine, the same assets and all that, and we're basically going to try to replicate the same benchmark that was done on the Scorpio on this GTX 1070 and i5 4690K PC, and see just exactly how the Scorpio matches up with the PC with the GTX 1070. Now I'm going to have GPU-Z open, which is a hardware monitor, and that's going to let us see basically the GPU's utilization in percentage, and we can see how much it's being used. And I'm not going to be recording on screen, I'm going to be recording off screen because I want to make sure that all of the hardware resources are going to the game. And I know the Xbox Scorpio actually does have 4K 60 frame per second recording built into it, which is awesome because the PS4 Pro only has 1080p 30 frame per second recording built into it. And also, NVIDIA Shadowplay doesn't really have that much overhead, so I could do on-screen recording and it wouldn't really cause any problems, but I just want to be kind of neutral here and I want to keep recording off. Maybe I can do some sort of comparison in the future. And after we do that test, we're going to basically see how that percentage compares to what the Scorpio did, and then we're going to do the same exact test using Forza Horizon 3 with Xbox One level graphical settings, and we're going to see how the Scorpio will be able to handle Forza Horizon 3, at least an estimate. Now, Forza Motorsport 6 on Xbox One uses kind of an interesting mixture of settings compared to what the PC uses. So, Forza Motorsport 6 on the Xbox One runs at 1080p 60 frames per second, and there's dynamic settings to kind of make sure that it stays at this level. So what you see on Forza Motorsport 6 on the Xbox One is a reflection setting that is actually below PC's low setting, so I'm going to have it set to low on this PC version, and the shadow setting is also set to low. But for the most part, it's going to match with roughly medium to high settings on PC, so I'm actually just going to overestimate things and mostly just keep the settings on high, with obviously the appropriate settings set to low for PC. However, we are going to change the texture resolution because on the Xbox Scorpio version for this test, the 4K assets they put in were basically the PC's highest quality textures. That's the only change they did over the Xbox One. Every other setting was kept consistent. So what I have going on here is I have a replay going of one of my races that I just did. This isn't a video file, it's rendering in real time, which means that basically I can keep my hands off the controller and kind of go back and forth between my TV, which is showing my GPU load, and my monitor here, which is playing the game. So let's take a look at the screen here, and here's what we're getting for GPU load. You can kind of see it in the middle there. What we're doing here is, like I said, we're running settings roughly equivalent to what the Xbox One puts out, but with the textures all the way up and running in 4K. Now, I'm not totally sure if I'm using settings equivalent to the base Xbox One. They could be a bit lower, they could be a bit higher. I'm not totally sure because we don't know the settings. We know a few of the settings, like I set the shadows and reflections and stuff accordingly. But as you can see, Digital Foundry reported that the Xbox Scorpio is running at roughly 60 to 70% GPU load with maybe occasional spikes here and there. And that's pretty much what this is doing right here. So yeah, they're right. The Xbox Scorpio, using hardware roughly equal to a GTX 1060, at least in this game right here, is punching in the weight class of a GTX 1070. That's pretty impressive, but it's also kind of to be expected. Usually that's what you get in a console, is it usually punches a little bit above its weight class. Let's go back to the screen here. So yeah, this is basically on an identical test to what they were doing on the Xbox Scorpio there, and we're getting the same results, which is pretty neat. So that was pretty interesting. I honestly did not expect the results to be literally that close to what Digital Foundry said. It really does punch in the weight class of a GTX 1070, at least from what we've seen here so far. And keep in mind, Forza Motorsport 6 is a pretty well-optimized PC game for both AMD and NVIDIA hardware. Now, what about Forza Horizon 3? Let's take a look at this game real quick. On the base Xbox One, it runs in 1080p 30 frames per second, with most of the settings at high, a few of the settings a bit lower, and it does have dynamic settings on to keep it in its proper visual settings, and it has 4x multi-sampling anti-aliasing. Now, because we're going to be bringing this up to 4K, if we were to bring the same MSAA setting up, it would actually scale not in a linear way, it would be exponential, so the performance hit would be far worse. So what I'm going to do is dial back the MSAA to 2x, which is basically what I would expect them to do on the Scorpio if they were able to get it to 4K and have a little bit of overhead. So let's take a look at the results for that. Now here's Forza Horizon 3, and like Forza Motorsport 6, I have this one set to the Xbox One equivalent settings, but with the texture quality turned all the way up for all of the options. So that's the highest texture option, and I know I have it sitting still right here. I don't have any sort of like demo or replay up, but whether you're in motion, near water, getting, effects on the screen, or sitting still, it's pretty much all the same GPU utilization. And this one's interesting. So if the Scorpio is going to be GTX 1070 level performance across the board, then the base Xbox One only puts about 52% load if you take the base Xbox One settings, increase the textures, and bring it up to 4K. Only about 53% load. Even if you go to different areas. Here, I'll switch to a different area right now compared to what's on the screen. Here we go. Same kind of result here. We're in a different area. It's a more suburban area. Got some cars going around. Same idea. Still at 54%. What if we unlock the frame rate to 60 frames per second instead of capping it at 30. Will this game be able to do it? Let's take a look. Now, what we're getting here is pretty much an expected result based on the percentages we were seeing earlier. The frame rate counter up here is showing a pretty steady 60. Even when I was driving around doing a bunch of crazy stuff, it pretty much didn't go anywhere below like 58 or so. Again, these are Xbox One equivalent settings with the highest possible textures. And what we get here is the GPU load anywhere from like 95 to 100%. So here's what I think is going to happen on Scorpio. The GTX 1070 level performance we're seeing from it is a direct result of heavy optimization on both the hardware and software level, while we're seeing here basically nothing. So they would have to pull some miracles in order to get an absolute locked 60 in Forza Horizon 3 at these Xbox One level settings at 4K, 60 frames per second. They can easily do 30 frames per second. So the score, we'll definitely see it in like 4K, 30 frames per second. Now, I'm going to do a quick test here. The MSAA is weird because the way it scales with resolution is it actually is exponential, as I was saying. So I'm going to disable the MSAA and see how it performs in comparison, because they could actually just disable MSAA altogether and still get a better picture quality than the 1080p with 4x MSAA that we saw on the Xbox One. So let's take a look at how that affects the performance graph here in the same exact scene as we're seeing on the screen here. So when we're disabling the MSAA, some idiot's crashing into me, some AI driver, we don't get really a big drop in image quality. In fact, it's very similar, and considering the fact that people will be sitting at their TVs, I actually expect them to pretty much keep MSAI off even when the original Xbox One might have it in effect, because at 4K you don't need it as much. So what we see on here on the GPU load is usually around 85 to 92%, which, you know, doesn't seem like a huge drop. That's like 100, like 90 to 100, down to maybe like 7% if we're seeing where it stays consistently. But every little percentage counts, and considering how small of a drop in image quality you get by disabling MSAA, that might just be what they would do if they wanted to get a 4K 60 mode for Forza Horizon 3. However, what I think is going to happen is basically what they said in the article is Microsoft was planning on doing the way Scorpio games would work is, for the most part, you'll see a higher resolution mode that matches the Xbox One settings, but outputs in 4K with maybe some higher textures and higher quality assets, and a performance mode which may run at lower graphic qualities, lower resolutions. So we could see this running in like 1800p or 1440p, 60 frames per second with some MSAA and some settings up, and it would actually run just fine. Let's actually take a look and see how that runs. Here's our promising result. This is 1440p with the Xbox One equivalent settings with 2x MSAA instead of 4x, which actually comes out to around the same in terms of scalability. And this is the headroom that we get on our graph. So what we're seeing here is anywhere from 65 to 70%, sometimes lower, sometimes higher, depending on spikes, and no matter what the location is. So that's a little bit of headroom that they can use to increase the graphics a little bit, but give a performance mode to Forza Horizon 3. And this is probably what we're going to see for most of these games. And like I said, the GTX 1070 level performance comes from the optimization. So who knows, it depends on the game on how far they can push that. But I just thought these results were pretty interesting, that, you know, this graph was basically showing that. That's cool. So there you go, we got our confirmation that the Xbox Scorpio is pretty much going to be running at the power level of roughly around a GTX 1070, and we played around with Forza Horizon 3 for a bit to kind of see what they could do with that game and maybe some other Xbox Scorpio optimized games, and just see where it stands. And what I thought was pretty neat was just how it scaled exactly how we would want it to. If we had the Xbox One level settings with no multi-sample anti-aliasing at 4K, it could easily do 30 FPS. In fact, it could easily do 30 FPS with 2 or even 4x MSAA. They could keep that in there, or they could ramp up some graphical settings. No issues there whatsoever. In 1440p, it's even more interesting. At 2x MSAA, it easily holds roughly, 90% of the power level of the graphics card, which means it will probably do roughly the same thing on the Scorpio, meaning 1440p at Xbox One settings with 2x MSAA at 60 frames per second for a performance mode is totally plausible. They could also, for that mode, disable MSAA and maybe ramp some settings up, but I don't think they're going to do that. It depends on what they do. I mean, what really matters is what the developer decides to do with the game, not what the hardware level on the PC dictates. So there we go. Despite the fact that I do agree that the Scorpio definitely has a lot of cards stacked against its favor right now, I am pretty freaking excited for the system, and I will be buying it day one, doing a full unboxing and setup and all that good stuff, and it's finally going to fill in that gap on my TV stand where you have a PS4 Pro on the left, Switch in the middle, and then nothing on the right. Gotta put the Scorpio in there. It'll be a perfect fit. So I'll see you guys next time. You all have a great rest of your day. Have a good one, and thank you so much for watching.